Make a fun signal like a car horn or a duck quacking or something.
All right, you are good to go.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the September Finance Committee meeting. The main topic this afternoon is our fiscal year 2019-2020 closeout figures. We have now closed the books on the fiscal year that ended June 30th of 2020. And we're just going to touch on some highlights of things in the major funds of the city. And I'm going to try to share my screen now. Does everybody see that?
Looks good over here.
Okay, so I first wanted to point out that we are not looking at every fund of the city. This page is actually page 42 of your budget document, and it lists all of the funds of the city. You see there that the various departments of the city's general fund are listed there, and the general fund is one fund that encompasses all of those departments. Then there are several special revenue funds that are highlighted in blue. And by special revenue fund, what is meant is that these are segregated funds because there is some revenue source that has some strings attached to it. And so we account for those revenues in a separate fund so that they are not commingled with funds that do not have those individual strings attached to them. The green are the various enterprise funds of the city, particularly the utility enterprises. And one thing that I would point out there is that of the water reclamation fund, there are a couple of sub-funds, again, because there are distinct and segregated revenue sources for the sewer maintenance rate, which is the $5 sewer maintenance rate that can only be used to maintain the neighborhood lateral sewer lines. And there is the new development excise tax fund that can only be used for expansion of the sewer system, and that is charged to developers based on the size of the development or the number of employees for commercial developments. There are several capital funds, including the major capital fund, which we know of as Fund 50, and that also accounts for the projects that are related to general obligation bond issues. They're accounted for in that capital fund. So that's why you see that both in the debt service area and in the capital fund. So I just wanted everyone to see all of the funds of the city as we touch on a few of them today. So the first major fund that we'll touch on is the largest fund of the city, usually, which is the city's general fund. And this is the fund that by definition, we account for everything that is not accounted for someplace else. And that is actually the statutory definition of the general fund. And I'll understand that this is the general taxing funds, the things that can be done more flexibly by council, the things that are paid for with general taxation, because these are paying for services that are being provided to all of the citizens and that cannot be denied to anyone. So these are things like streets and open parks and those sorts of things that are available to everyone. So those are paid for with taxes. As you see there on line 1, we began fiscal year 20 in column B with an actual fund balance of $8,281,000.
I'm still seeing the funding source for each department slide.
Yeah, you'll have to unshare it and then reshare a different screen.
Okay, show me how to do that. So if
Go to stop share on the top. the red button down, right there, stop share. And then just go to share screen again and choose a different screen.
I see, okay. How's that?
That's much better.
All right. Again, this is the general fund of the city. We started fiscal year 2019, 2020. This is column C, with an actual fund balance of $8,281,000. We had actual sales tax revenue in the general fund. And remember that sales tax does not just go to the general fund. It also goes to the public safety sales tax fund, the Norman Forward sales tax fund, the capital fund. So sales tax goes to several areas. But in the general fund, we actually had $41,203,000 of sales tax in fiscal year 2020. That was well below what we budgeted for in fiscal year 2020. And as you'll recall, we were moving along right on budget for most of the fiscal year, for the first 3 quarters of the year, until the COVID pandemic happened. And then in the last 2 or 3 months of the year, you'll recall that our sales tax dropped off substantially. And so we ended the year down, not just in the general fund, but everywhere that sales tax is being recorded. Our use tax, for those that I've not talked about this before, is basically a sales tax on goods that are purchased outside of the state of Oklahoma for use within Norman. So particularly that is catalog sales or online purchases that are delivered to Norman, because sales tax by law applies at the point of delivery. That obviously is a growing source of revenue. In fiscal year 20, we budgeted for $4.78 million of use tax revenue, and we actually recorded $6.7 million of use tax revenue. So that was a really good, strong revenue source in this past fiscal year. That was moderated somewhat by our franchise fee revenues, where we budgeted for $7.8 million and only recorded $6.5 million. So we were down about $1.3 million in franchise fees. And that is where we charge the private utilities like OG&E, OEC, ONG, Cox Cable for the use of the public's right-of-way. And they pay us a percentage of their revenues. But when their revenues are down, our franchise fee revenues go down. And it's really like our water revenues, driven in large part by the weather. And when we had a mild summer, like we did last year and the year before, and we have a warm winter like we did last year, our combined franchise fee revenues go down. I have jokingly said that for franchise fees, drought is good. Hot weather is good for electric fee revenue. Really cold weather is good for ONG revenue. But all of those things really worked against us in the last fiscal year. So we had a down year for franchise fee revenue. Our fines and forfeiture revenue was pretty much right on budget. Our license and permit revenues are pretty much right on budget. And that is driven almost entirely by the building industry. Those are the building permit fees that are paid when contractors and builders take out building permits, and we get a fee for that. Dropping down to line 25, this is where the transportation fund paid back some of the funds that the general fund upfronted when we started the transit service in last fiscal year. So you see that this is a revenue where $2.3 million was paid back once we started getting the operating grant revenue from the Federal Transit Administration. But the general fund upfronted here on line 52 $5.2 million. So the general fund on a net basis upfronted about $3 million to the public transit service, to the transit fund. And that really affects our bottom line. That really explains everything that happened with our bottom line in this last fiscal year in the general fund. You'll recall everything that was happening last November when the council was closing out and amending the University North Park Tiff Fund. And we stopped apportioning sales tax to the Tiff Fund further along into the fiscal year than we budgeted for. So when all the petition actions were closed out, the Tiff Fund paid back the apportionments that we made during the months of July, August, September, and October. So that was about $1 million that came back to the general fund that you see here on line 28. So all things taken together, we did a really good job of budgeting, right? So in the general fund on line 33 rather, you see that we budgeted for $82.9 million of revenue in the general fund, and we actually recorded $82 million. So we were within 1% of our projected revenues during the course of the fiscal year. But as you know, there was a whole lot of ups and downs and unknowns that factored into that on a net basis, good budgeting. On the expenditure side, we budgeted for salary and expenditures, and remember that in the general fund, the major source of expenditure is salaries and benefits. That's not the case in the enterprise funds, but in the general fund, these operating funds, the driving force for the expenditures is salaries and benefits. We budgeted for $57,992,000 of expenditure. We actually spent $57,323,000. That's a good thing. We underspent by $600,000, even though we had a cost of living adjustment that we did not budget for, but that we paid. So we were $600,000 or thereabouts below what we budgeted for salaries and expenditures. But remember that we budgeted for a savings of $1.5 million. So we did not achieve our presumed employee turnover savings. But we did meet and exceed our projected savings for supply and materials and services and maintenance. We budgeted for $6 million of expenditure in supply and materials, and we only spent $4.8 million. We budgeted for $11.3 million of service and maintenance expenditures, and we only spent $8.8 million. So that's a good thing. The departmental managers and the city manager, as you'll recall, was very aggressive in mandating these sorts of savings and taking money out of departmental budgets and moving it to the city manager's budget such that it could not be spent without the city manager's approval. And all of those things taken together successfully enabled us to hold to the bottom line and save some money such that that net $3 million shortfall of expenditures related to revenues was not a lot worse than it would have otherwise been. We get a lot of questions about the subsidy to the Westwood Fund, primarily to the golf course. You see that we budgeted for a $575,000 subsidy to the golf course. This is on line 45, and we actually only had a subsidy of $280,000 to the Westwood Fund, primarily to the golf course. And remember that before COVID, and we actually had to shut down the golf course in April, the weather was really good in April, and we probably would have had a really good or break-even year in the Westwood Fund if not for the COVID shutdown in the golf course. But we did have a $280,000 subsidy to the Westwood Fund. We discussed previously with the Mayor's Roundtable the subsidy that we had, and we talked about this with the council study session on Tuesday night, the subsidy to the Public Safety Sales Tax Fund from the general fund. We budgeted for a subsidy of $1.1 million, and that subsidy was actually $1.52 million. So the Public Safety Sales Tax Fund does not cover its expenditures, and that is an ongoing factor that the general fund is absorbing. We've talked about that, and it is projected to continue into the future and accelerate. That subsidy is expected to worsen in the future, where the general fund is absorbing some of the costs of the Public Safety Sales Tax Fund. You'll remember that that was not unexpected, and we'll talk about this, but just know that when the Public Safety Sales Tax 2 ordinance was approved, it was envisioned that the public safety sales tax operations would be absorbed into the general fund after the critical capital needs were completed. So this was not unanticipated when Public Safety Sales Tax 2 was approved. But just know that the reality is hitting us now, that the general fund is absorbing costs of the public safety sales tax and will continue to do so. Notice here on line 55 that we budgeted for $700,000 of emergency reserve expenditure. This is the 1% mandated reserve for emergencies. We did not spend any of that in fiscal year 2020, and that helped us out with this savings that you see in the service and maintenance category. We, by ordinance, have to budget for that, and so we budgeted $813,000 in this fiscal year 21. We hope that we don't have to spend all of that, but unfortunately, we have already spent some of that this fiscal year with the windstorm that we had earlier, and we did in fact call in the contractors, and we spent over $100,000 to clean up from that storm. All of those things taken together in fiscal year 20, then, the general fund spent on line 65, $3 million more than what we brought in. And we actually closed last fiscal year with a fund balance of $5,265,000. That's okay. That means that we're still meeting our mandated 3% operating reserve in the general fund, and we are exceeding it slightly. But we are $33,000 below where we really want to be for that general fund operating reserve. And again, we hope to make that up in the coming fiscal year as we go forward. Any questions related to the general fund or anything that I did not talk about that council wants to talk about?
I have a quick question about the PSST, Anthony. You said that when that was passed, we knew this would happen. Did we know it would be this severe?
No, we it's worse than we thought it would be. We have the public safety sales tax has dropped into the negative quicker than we thought it would, because sales taxes have grown at a slower pace than we thought they would, and expenditures have grown faster than we thought they would. But we knew at some point in the future we would get to this point.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so moving over quickly then to the Net Revenue Stabilization Fund, better known as the Rainy Day Fund. You see that we started fiscal year 20 with a rainy day fund balance of $3,794,419. And we closed last fiscal year with a rainy day fund balance of $3,889,000. That exceeds our minimum rainy day fund balance of by $625,000. But that is short of our 5% targeted rainy day fund balance. And as you'll recall, by the ordinance, council makes a mid-year review of where we want to be with that rainy day fund balance. And for the last 4 or 5 fiscal years, council has tried to maintain that rainy day fund balance at its targeted level. So we're not violating any mandated reserve levels in the rainy day fund. We are meeting our minimum, which is 4% of general fund expenditures, but we are short of our targeted level. So when the actual audit has been accepted by council and the books are in fact really closed, council will make some decisions about whether you want to make a deposit from the general fund to the rainy day fund to bring it up to its targeted level, or if you're comfortable with just meeting the minimum.
I have a question about that real quick, and this might be a question for Daryl. Can CARES funding be used to build up our rainy day fund? I mean, I feel like that's what cities need to make themselves whole in terms of CARE funding, which is why I hated the reimbursement thing. Is that a possible use? And again, how much would that cost if we wanted to do that mid-year? Is it that amount that I'm saying, the 192?
Yes.
The CARES Act money, under the current guidance of the U.S. Treasury Department, we will have drawn down all 9.6 million that Mr. Francisco will be holding aside. It's unappropriated. Council could absolutely, from that balance, bring your emergency reserve up to your target.
And if we decide not to do that, because there are a laundry list of expenses that we could use that $9+ million for, my question would be, how will that impact us in the long term? Because it's going to be a rough year. It'll be probably several rough years but for everybody. I mean, it's not like this is just bad for Norman, but what are the consequences if we opt to not do that?
It is a matter of time, and in every one of these scenarios, I think we're all rolling the dice. We meet our mandated minimum, so we can check all the boxes and say we are legally compliant. The risk, even if we were at our 5% and there is some major catastrophic event or larger impact to our general fund than is currently anticipated, no matter how much you stick in the reserve, there's always a question, is that enough? And we established policies to allow us to say, okay, we've made a conscious effort, 5% is our target. And if there were to be events that caused us to dip into reserves beyond the 5%, at least we did it based on a policy. I mean, we're not just throwing, darts at a dartboard and picking a number. So there's value into trying to achieve your policy objectives. Now, we've met our legal requirement. If we don't use CARES Act to bring this number up, what we'll do is, and Mr. Francisco takes this activity very seriously. We're looking at a monthly basis at all of our revenues coming in. We're looking at all of our expenditures going out, particularly in the general fund. This is where we recognize the greatest level of volatility. Basically, what we know is when we get to June 30, close the books and figure out how much revenue exceeded expenditures. And if we get to June 30, 2021, and revenues have exceeded expenditures, goal one from staff's perspective is to achieve this policy objective to get that back up to 5%. And then anything above and beyond that would become part of resources available for the following budget year for council to appropriate. So this is a thing that staff's always going to strive to recover to achieve your policy objective. It doesn't have to be done in 1 year. It can be done over time. And I think there's probably 1,000 agencies across the US having this exact conversation.
And one hopefully quick question, we're hoping for another support package from the federal government. That would be an obvious way to plug this hole, is if that's a big if, local governments get any more money, but something to keep in mind. And I would encourage council, again, if you haven't already reached out to our federal legislators asking for more funding for cities, after having this meeting is a perfect opportunity to do so.
We did hear that the House was told they were going to stay in DC until a deal was reached. I heard a $1.1 trillion number this afternoon. Haven't seen any details as to what is proposed in the 1.1 trillion. No, excuse me, 1.5 trillion. was what was being discussed this afternoon. So we should be seeing details as to what that proposal looks like on the next round of COVID support here in the next couple of days.
Next fund is the Public Safety Sales Tax Fund. We've talked a little bit about this, but just a few things that I wanted to touch on here. We actually started this fiscal year 2019-2020, with a fund balance of $10.4 million in the Public Safety Sales Tax Fund. That is because, remember, that we have outstanding bond revenues that are obligated to pay for the radio communication system and for the Emergency Operations Center building. And we had made the assumption that those projects would move along faster than they have, but that money is still sitting there in the fund for when we actually complete primarily the EOC building. That will draw down that fund balance. On the operational side there, then you see that we budgeted for $9,939,000, and we actually brought in $9.4 million of public safety sales tax revenue. Again, we were clocking right along budget until April, May, June, when the COVID hit. We are exceeding revenues from the public safety use tax. So on the revenue side, public safety sales and use tax fund is pretty much on budget. And that's what you see, the total revenues for the year of $13.2 million, and I'm just exceeding it by a little bit. So we did a really good job on the revenue side, all things taken together in the public safety sales tax fund. But notice that that $1.5 million that we talked about coming from the general fund, that's a revenue to the public safety sales tax fund on line 11. So when we say that we had a really good year and we broke even in the public safety sales tax fund, that is because the general fund made up the operational whole. The expenditures are a little bit above budget for last fiscal year. We budgeted $13.3 million of expenditure, and we actually spent $14.2 million. The major area that we overspent in that year was for capital equipment, some carryover expenditures, particularly for fire apparatus that was paid for in this fiscal year, impacted on that number. But again, the main things to keep in mind about the public safety sales tax fund is how much the general fund is having to subsidize it and how much is reserved for those outstanding critical capital need projects that you see as a reserve on line 48.
Anthony,
Yes.
is the interfund transfer for capital, is that for the fire equipment that you just went over? I keep trying to scroll up your screen, but I can't.
No.
There you go. So on line 12?
No, that is where the capital fund, just like it does in the general fund, where capital equipment is being replaced, police cars, fire trucks, those sorts of things that are in the public safety sales tax fund, that when we do the ranking of how we're going to spend the capital outlay funds from the capital sales tax, some of those funds went towards vehicles in the public safety sales tax area. So just as the capital fund makes a transfer to the general fund for those vehicles that are being replaced in the general governmental area, where vehicles are being replaced in the public safety sales tax area, the capital fund transfers money to cover those expenditures in the PSST fund.
Okay, so in the PSST fund, it's not set up such that the quote unquote capital penny that we have in the general side going into the capital fund, they don't have their own separated allocation for capital within PSST?
No, actually they
Revenues?
do. There is a separate allocation within the Public Safety Sales Tax Fund for capital equipment. That's what you see on line 25, or rather 24.
Yeah, so that's why I'd asked,
Okay, and that's
but
where
this is over and above. Basically, they went, we needed more capital monies from the general capital fund, whatever that would be called, to cover equipment that the capital penny, for the PSST capital penny, for lack of a better name, whatever that would be called, on line 24 could not cover. Is that what, correct?
yes.
Okay, that's, thank
In
you.
other, there's a pot of money for capital outlay each year out of the capital sales tax.
Mhm.
There's a competition for how that capital outlay money is going to be used, and the fleet maintenance division and the IT division does rankings of what is most critically needed to be replaced.
Mhm.
And this is citywide. This is not just in the public safety area, but it's also for street maintenance, replacing backhoes, or park maintenance, replacing lawnmowers. All of those things are taken in competition for the capital sales tax, capital outlay allocation that council makes.
Mhm.
Once those rankings are established, if it so happens that some vehicles that are in the public safety sales tax area rank highly for replacement, then yes, out of that capital outlay money in the capital sales tax, some of that goes to the public safety sales tax fund to replace those vehicles. The set aside in public safety sales tax is primarily for the fire truck replacement program that was established in the public safety sales tax.
Okay, and how much was that, 1.5? This is really
In
small.
last fiscal year, yes.
Okay. All right, thank you very much.
Other questions?
Anthony, if I may, to that same point, isn't it accurate to say that the PSST did not anticipate replacement costs for capital? That was also anticipated to come from the general capital account. So now that we are getting to replacing 10-year-old police cars, and there will eventually will be fire trucks, that will continue to come from the city's capital fund, not PSST.
That's correct.
So that might be something we would need to be talking about at the retreat as well, when it comes to if we're going to try to re-envision what PSST, putting it back on its own 2 feet and being able to cover expenses. Maybe that's something we would want to discuss about if we're going to go back to the voters.
Certainly
Thank
one
you for
thing
that,
we
Mr.
discussed.
O'Leary. That was helpful.
The next fund is one that usually, usually we don't talk much about the room tax fund. It's usually just kind of clocks along, does its job, that sort of thing. And when we get to this year-end closeout discussion, we're usually not talking about the room tax fund. But this year, the room tax fund is a major issue. The COVID experience has struck particularly hard in the room tax area, because the depressed, for lack of a better term, travel industry and the shutdown of hotels and the slow comeback of hotels has really struck hard on our room tax revenue. You see that we started last fiscal year with a fund balance of $358,700 in the room tax fund. And we budgeted for $1.9 million of revenue in the room tax fund, but we only actually brought in $1.3 million of room tax revenue. So our room tax revenue was almost 35% below budget for last fiscal year. And again, it had been clocking along right on budget for most of the fiscal year until March or April. The impact of that is that during the year, last fiscal year, we actually reduced the amount that we were paying to our partners at the Arts Council with the Arts and Humanities portion of the room tax. And we reduced the amount that we were budgeted to pay to the Convention and Visitors, the Convention and Tourism portion of the room tax by over $100,000. But we still overspent our room tax revenue by $325,000 in last fiscal year. So that healthy fund balance that we started with was drawn down to a very unhealthy $33,600 at the end of last fiscal year. And that is exacerbated when you look down below the bottom line here at the various components of the reserves of that room tax fund balance. So the Arts and Humanities portion of the room tax fund balance actually closed last fiscal year with a negative fund balance of $87,000, and the Convention and Visitors portion closed last fiscal year with a negative fund balance of their portion of $151,000. In other words, if Visit Norman was standing on its own, we couldn't have closed last year's books for Visit Norman. If the Arts Council was standing on its own, we would not have been able to legally close the books on the Arts Council. $87,000 would have had to come from someplace, or $150,000 would have had to come from someplace for the Convention and Visitors portion. Fortunately, the parks portion, because it's more flexible, we just kind of put off some of those parks capital projects to bring that portion of the total room tax to positive. So the positive bottom line, if you will, in the room tax fund as a whole means that we don't have to make any emergency transfers just to close the books. But just understand that these portions of the room tax fund that are in the negative has to be made up going forward and into the future and into next fiscal year. That wouldn't have been so bad, except that going into the fiscal year that we are now in, we budgeted a room tax revenue of $1.75 million, which was a little bit below what we budgeted last year, but it was about what we budgeted to bring in last fiscal year before COVID hit. This $1.75 million revenue estimate for this fiscal year was made under the assumption that by football season, our room tax revenues, which are highly dependent on hotel rooms being, totally booked up in Norman on those 6 home football weekends. And remember that usually on those home football weekends, 100% of our hotels are booked up with a 2-night minimum, 9 months in advance, okay? But now we have the reality that OU Stadium is going to only be filled at 25% of its capacity, and our hotels are only running at 40 or 50%. I think Dan Shim is on the call. He can correct me if I'm wrong, but only 30 or 40%, at least for this first home football game, which means that we are not going to meet this revenue estimate this year. So this problem that we see down here at the bottom line is going to be worse. And we have to take action in advance to think about how we're going to handle that. Based on current trends, I would project that I think we really need to cut this revenue estimate about in half for this fiscal year that we are in now, because this 25% of football capacity is for the whole season. And we have already lost what would have been our biggest visitation weekend for a football game, because the Tennessee game, which would have been the biggest home game of the year, has been totally canceled. So when we compare September of 2020 to September of 2019, it's going to be really bad. So I am suggesting that we should cut that revenue projection by about half. And if there's anyone who wants to disagree with that, obviously when we make that decision, we are going to have to take those actions of reducing our payments to the Arts and Humanities Council and to the Convention and Visitors Bureau going forward. And that is going to really impact them negatively and will impact on the services that they provide negatively. But that's the reality. And as you go into your retreat, or as you want to talk about it now, just know that that is the reality that we need to confront.
I think it's worth mentioning that the money that we are having to supplement PSST now more than ever could go elsewhere to keep things afloat. I mean, not just our rainy day fund, but these funds. I mean, it's the arts and Visit Norman that some of their main goals are to bring people to Norman, and we have to make sure they're afloat. And if the Dan Shim is on the call, it's my understanding that Visit Norman, because of how they are set up, I think it's a 501c4, was not eligible for any assistance from the federal government, which is exactly why that $5 million bond proposal was huge. It was to fill these holes in our local community. But we don't have that, so there's no point in crying over spilled milk, but we clearly have more than one hole to fill this year. And I think we have to be realistic, like what you said, for people who don't think football is a revenue stream for Norman, that is a clear example. And I would love to know if someone is on the call who can answer it, what the capacity was for our hotels this past weekend, because I think that will give us a better idea of what to amend this to. Dan commented it's a 501c6, not eligible for PPP, so I was close. Dan, do you happen to know the overall capacity for our hotels this past home game?
So we get those numbers on a monthly basis as a whole or an aggregate, and not by the weekend or room night, but reaching out to our hotel partners. Thankfully on Wednesday, we were running 30% to 40% occupancy before the game. Thankfully, we were able to get a little pickup on Friday. So we're up closer to 50% for many or most of our properties, 40% for some of our much larger ones east of town. But
out of curiosity, were they charging the same rates as a normal football year, or was it reduced in hopes they could get more people in?
Absolutely not. So generally, for example, the Tennessee game that Anthony's talking about, or an Ohio State that we had a few weekends ago, we're getting 4 times the typical average rate. For a normal hotel night on just an average game, you're getting close to double what a typical hotel room night would cost. For this game, it was the same as what we would charge any day, and even down from what pre-COVID rates were. So rates were slashed. There was not a 2-night minimum stay requirement. Hotels were just trying to get some folks in for the 1 night.
Thank you for that. That's, I think, again, very helpful in putting a realistic amendment to that line item.
If there are no other questions, I'll move along to the Parking and Transportation Fund. I didn't really have anything to point out here. I just wanted to educate council and the public that there is a public and transit fund. The major revenues for that fund are from the operating grant revenue that we get from the Federal Transit Administration. It was $2.1 million last year. We talked about a lot of that was transferred to the general fund to offset the upfront money that came from the general fund. In this coming fiscal year, we budgeted about $2 million again to come from that Federal Transit Administration grant. You see that we also budgeted for the $5.1 million one-time grant that is coming from the Federal Transit Administration to pay for part of the cost of the transit maintenance facility. So that is a budgeted revenue one time in fiscal year 2020, 2021. We budgeted for $2.5 million of sales tax in this fiscal year. We actually had $544,000 of public transit sales tax revenue for that partial part of last fiscal year that revenues came in from the public transit sales and use tax. And we hope that that will be an ongoing revenue source going forward. So again, I just wanted council to see the operations of Fund 27, the Public Transit Fund. Are any questions about that? If not, then I'll move on to the Westwood Fund. And we talked about the general fund subsidy to the Westwood Fund. It's an expenditure from the general fund, a revenue to the Westwood Fund, and all of those things taken together. The Westwood Fund closed last fiscal year with a fund balance of $70,848, of which $70,000 is reserved for pool capital replacement. So again, Westwood Fund, we try to operate with a zero fund balance each year. And we hope that we don't have to have this subsidy going forward, and we did not budget for it in the coming fiscal year. Any questions about that fund?
I have a quick question. I believe Westwood opened, even with the COVID situation, not much later, but that would have been in the last fiscal year anyway. Do you foresee the capacity limitations negatively impacting the predicted revenue for the Westwood Aquatic Center?
It sure did in last fiscal year. Again, the Aquatic Center operates at a profit. And it certainly was looking that way. The weather was great in April. And when the Aquatic Center was going to be opening up roughly Memorial Day weekend, we would have been going gangbusters, but because of COVID and the reduced capacity at Westwood, recall that last summer, last swim season, we were actually turning people away from Westwood. And there would be no reason to think that we would have not done the same thing this year. Capacity at Westwood Aquatic Center is 500 and something. I don't know if Judd is on the call to correct me if I'm wrong, but they had to reduce the capacity by 50% at one point and to 75% at one point, and that directly impacts on the revenue. So again, this actual revenue number of $1.5 million would have been better if it were not for COVID.
Mr. Francisco's numbers are correct. And during the entire season, we wound up shutting down, it was either 2 days or 3 days. We had a lifeguard who worked a double shift test positive for COVID. So they were exposed to a lot of other lifeguard staff. So we had to close down for a couple of days. We sent all the lifeguards to Emmy, got them all tested, all came back negative, put them back to work, reopened the pool, and really never saw any contact tracing issues to ever come back to the Westwood pool. So we would say that that limited capacity worked as intended, and we never really saw a hotspot happen at the Westwood gatherings.
Moving on to the Waterfront, I know council has talked a lot about the proposed water rate increase. And I just wanted to bring to your attention that we did not budget for that water rate increase this year. We budgeted for $20,700,000 in basic water enterprise revenue in the water fund last year, and we were right on that budget. Another trophy for Mr. Kaminsky. But just remember that there's a whole lot of uncertainties that go into that. But in a mild summer with water revenues right on budget, that's a really good job. But what I wanted to bring to your attention is how much the water fund is driven by capital expenditures. So last year, we estimated that $30 million would be spent on capital projects, and another $10 million out of the bonds that we sold for the water treatment plant improvements. And we actually spent a lot of that, but just know that where we are projecting a fund balance of $45 million starting last fiscal year and $9 million this year, and we're projecting that that $9 million fund balance will be drawn down substantially in this fiscal year with an ending fund balance of $2 million, of which $17 million is reserved for capital improvements. Just know that, yes, council has discretion over when those capital improvements are done. And what we're talking about for the most part here, and I believe Mr. Mattingly is on the call, but what we're talking about here is those ongoing water well expansion projects and the big project that's proposed for the water well distribution line project and the water well treatment project. We're gonna blend some of the good wells, if you will, with the arsenic wells so that the combined water meets all of the potable water standards. That's a multi-million-dollar project that is included in these expenditures and that we can't go forward with until we get the adequate rate structure to pay for it. Because again, in order to pay for those projects, I have to sell revenue bonds or get statewide revolving fund money from the Oklahoma Water Resources Board. And no one is going to lend us that money if we cannot demonstrate an adequate rate structure to repay that debt. So again, those are the driving forces behind what's going on in the water fund.
And Anthony, there is a deadline behind those capital improvements, correct? Because I don't think anybody on council wants to ask residents for an increase in water rates with all of this uncertainty going on. But can you please refresh our memories about what that deadline may be? And if not you, Chris Mattingly, please.
Yeah, I'll defer to Chris on that one, but basically the deadline that's upon us is adequate water supply. And do we want to get into a place where we're going to have to ration water again? Then there are mandates that may come down about what is adequate or potable drinking water. And can we blend it, or at what level do we have to treat it? And obviously, the more we have to treat it, the more the cost. So if I'm misleading in any way, please jump in here, Chris.
Yeah, it probably is going to be, right now, the DEQ has asked us to disinfect our groundwater supply. And so what we're going to be looking at is bringing collection lines to one spot so that all the wells could be disinfected. And right now it's not a consent order or anything of that type. It's just in discussions with the DEQ saying that we will start moving towards that. And that's one of the large capital items. And the other one was the metering, actually, the 14 million for the AMI. That is just, and I wanted to, I'll be sure to explain these to you at the council retreat in October and try to give you all the details about it. So.
Any other questions on the water fund? Moving on then to the Norman Forward Fund. In fiscal year 20, we budgeted for $9.6 million of sales tax revenue in the Norman Forward Fund. We actually brought in 9.4. We budgeted for $650,000 of use tax revenue and brought in $1.1 million. So at the bottom line, we were over our revenue projections in the Norman Forward Fund, and we are continuing with those projects. You see that we had budgeted for the third tranche, and I know that Councilmember Nash, I throw around this term tranche, assuming that everybody knows what I'm talking about. But basically, tranche is a French word that means bucket. And in the financial world, that means you anticipate doing debt in various pieces, buckets, if you will. We anticipated doing 3 tranches of debt for the Norman Forward program. We have actually issued 2 of those bonds, and we actually anticipated doing the 3rd one in last fiscal year. But because some of the projects got delayed and pushed back with uncertainty about what we would actually do and how much we would spend, we also delayed the 3rd debt issuance for Norman Forward, but we'll be moving forward with that here in the near future. We currently estimate that instead of that 3rd tranche being about $38 million, it'll be somewhere around $23 million because the projects are at their budgeted level, but delayed. So we'll be able to do some things on a pay-as-you-go basis that we thought we may have to do on a debt basis. So we don't have to issue as much debt. That'll save us some interest cost. But just know that that'll be coming forward here in the near future. All of those things taken together, we have a big ending fund balance in the Norman Forward Fund, but that's just waiting on those projects to move forward. Any questions about that fund? If not, then I'll move forward to the final fund that we're going to touch on here, which is the University North Park Tiff Fund. And I just wanted to show you how those things actually play out, those things that council has directed. And we know that there have been a lot of ups and downs and ins and outs to get us to where we actually ended fiscal year 20 with sales tax revenue of $2.2 million plus $450,000 of economic development sales tax. So again, about $2.7 million of apportioned sales tax to the Tiff Fund last fiscal year, and about $2.1 million of property tax into the Tiff Fund last year. We talked about how $1 million of that went back to the general fund that should not have been apportioned, and $300,000 of that went back to the capital fund that should not have been apportioned. All of those things taken together, we closed last fiscal year with a fund balance of $17.7 million in the University of North Park Tiff Fund, of which about $500,000 is reserved for the bid contributions that have come in from the Business Improvement District and the property owners in University of North Park. So we closed last fiscal year with about $17.2 million in the bank, separated out from the city's coffers and ready to pay for the $16.2 or so million worth of remaining authorized projects in the University of North Park Tiff Fund. And you'll recall that last council meeting, council approved the expenditure of $1 million of that for the Robinson and Crossroads I-35 West Frontage Road project. And we're about to move forward with $2 million expenditure for the purchase of the land for the indoor aquatic and multi-sport facility. And there is another $2.7 million of TIF funds that are go toward that construction supplement for that project. So about $4 million of that is already kind of out the door and spoken for. And the other authorized projects, we have money in the bank to cover them. So that's the TIF fund story. If there's any questions about that one, I'll try to respond to them. If there are no other questions, that ends our fiscal year end 2019-2020 discussion. You see that we were doing pretty well and really well on budget, and everything was going along just fine and until COVID hit. But we have a lot of things to confront going forward. But we closed last fiscal year in a position to move forward and just hope that we don't have to hunker down too long.
I think I would.
Can you send that to us, that whole spreadsheet?
I didn't hear you, Councilmember.
I'm sorry, can you send me or all of us that spreadsheet that you just shared with us?
Yes.
Sorry,
And for anyone, it's all right. It's very difficult to stay on top of things in this format, but I appreciate everyone for doing the best we can. But I will take this opportunity to remind everyone watching and everyone in the meeting, and in the meeting is not the group I have to say this to, but please shop local. Please have a staycation and go treat yourselves to a lovely hotel stay here in Norman. Amazon is great, it's convenient, but we all need to do what we can to keep our dollars here in Norman. I know Anthony's seen some tough budgets and some tough situations, but I'm pretty sure he wasn't alive in 1918 to see the last pandemic and how that impacted municipal budgeting. So I appreciate how creative you've been in finding solutions in the past, but I will be so bold to ask you to be more creative than you have ever been before in helping us figure out how we're going to get through this. I would love like a running list of here are the funds that need X, Y, Z. So if and when we get more CARES funding, we know exactly where they need to go. And you've always done a great job of providing options. One of them was ending the TIF increment, and we moved forward on that. I would love your suggestions now, because I know we've always pivoted and been flexible with mid-year amendments and different changes like that. And it's a given that we're going to have to do that this year because of all of the unforeseen circumstances. So while not all of us are accountants, you do a very good job of explaining it. And there's a lot of moving parts, but I appreciate your time. Kim, your time as well. I know this is your baby too. And same thing with Chris. There's so many different areas that we're going to have to address. I believe I saw Aaron Gavigan and Dan's obviously on the call as well. It's time to get creative, and now more than ever, shop local. Any other questions or things to add?
One thing I would say, Mayor, about that CARES Act money, I would just caution council that that is one-time money and should only be used for one-time expenditures. I would only suggest that you not use it for ongoing expenditures like salaries. Don't add positions with that money. But if you wanted to fill up a hole in the room tax, or if you wanted to replace a bunch of vehicles or something like that, that's how I would suggest you would use those funds.
Well, as we talked about on Tuesday, a Norman council has already made that mistake back in the 70s, which kind of got us in a very unique situation that we find ourselves in today, as Mr. Mattingly is, I'm sure, not thrilled about right now. But we can make smart choices. We've got a great team. I think it's very clear where our holes are. And I know you've said it here, and I know you said it on Tuesday, but keep saying that this is for one-time money, one-time expenses, and we can't put a larger burden on us going forward. Anyone got anything else to add? Questions? All right. Thank you for a great presentation. And this retreat is going to be interesting. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Your Honor.
Mayor, did